The leather-bound manuscript crackled as Dr. Elena Vasquez turned the yellowed pages, her fingers trembling not from age, but from what she was reading. The handwriting was Victorian, elegant, but the words described events that happened 3 years before Bram Stoker ever published Dracula. Events that should have been impossible. Events that suggested the most famous vampire in literature wasn't fiction at all, but a desperate attempt to hide something far more terrifying than any monster. When you understand why someone would invent Dracula to cover up the truth, it'll be too late to forget what you've learned. The manuscript had arrived at the University of Edinburgh's Special Collections Department on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a courier who vanished before anyone could question him about its origins. Elena, the department's lead researcher in Victorian literature, had been skeptical when her assistant Marcus brought it to her attention. Another supposed lost work from the Gothic period, probably a clever forgery designed to fool collectors with more money than sense. But the paper felt right under her fingers. The ink had that particular fade that only comes from genuine age, and the binding showed wear patterns that would take decades to fake convincingly. If you want to see more discoveries that challenge everything we thought we knew about classic literature, subscribe now, because what Elena found in those pages would make her question whether fiction and reality had been deliberately blurred for over a century. The manuscript was titled "The Whitby Incidents: A True Account" and was signed by one Jonathan Harker, dated 1894. 3 years before Stoker's novel. Elena's first instinct was to dismiss it as an elaborate hoax, but as she read deeper, the details began to align in ways that sent ice through her veins. The geography was perfect, the historical references accurate to the day, and most disturbing of all, the events described bore an uncanny resemblance to Stoker's fictional narrative, but with crucial differences that made them infinitely more terrifying. According to Harker's account, he had indeed traveled to Transylvania on legal business, but not to Castle Dracula. Instead, he'd been summoned to investigate reports of an archaeological discovery that British interests wanted to acquire quietly. A series of underground chambers had been uncovered near Brasov, containing artifacts that defied conventional understanding of medieval history. The local authorities, overwhelmed by what they'd found, had reached out through diplomatic channels for assistance. The chambers, Harker wrote, contained evidence of a civilization that shouldn't have existed. Advanced metallurgy, complex astronomical calculations, and most bizarrely, what appeared to be detailed anatomical studies of human blood composition centuries before such knowledge should have been possible. But it wasn't the artifacts themselves that had terrified the Romanian officials. It was what else they'd found in those underground rooms. Bodies. Not skeletons, not mummies, but perfectly preserved corpses that looked as though they'd died yesterday, despite carbon dating that placed them in the 15th century. 7 individuals, each bearing identical marks on their throats, 2 small puncture wounds that had healed over completely before death. The local coroner's examination revealed that all 7 had died from extreme blood loss, yet their bodies contained no blood whatsoever. Every drop had been drained with surgical precision. Harker's account described his growing unease as he examined the site. The preserved bodies were arranged in a circle around a central stone altar, upon which lay an ornate chalice made of an unknown black metal. The chalice bore engravings in a script that predated any known written language in the region, yet somehow Harker found he could read portions of it, a phenomenon that disturbed him greatly, as he had no knowledge of ancient languages. The inscriptions, he claimed, described a ritual of eternal preservation through sacred consumption, and detailed methodologies for extracting and concentrating human blood for purposes that seemed to blur the line between alchemy and early medical experimentation. But the most chilling aspect of his discovery was the revelation that this wasn't an ancient practice at all. It was ongoing. Fresh clothing had been found folded neatly beside each body. Modern clothing, dating from the 1890s. The implications sent Harker fleeing from Transylvania in the dead of night, but his terror was far from over. Upon his return to England, he discovered that the archaeological site had been purchased by a British consortium led by someone calling himself Count Dracula, a name that appeared on no genealogical records despite claims of ancient nobility. Elena paused in her reading, cross-referencing the dates with historical records. If Harker's account was accurate, then Stoker hadn't created the character of Dracula. He'd borrowed the name from a real person who was engaged in something far more sinister than fictional vampirism. But the manuscript contained another revelation that made her hands shake as she turned the page. Harker had not been the only investigator sent to Romania. 3 others had been dispatched by different British institutions, each unaware of the other's missions. None of them had returned. Their disappearances had been quietly covered up, attributed to various accidents and illnesses. But Harker had discovered their true fate through correspondence with local contacts who had witnessed something impossible in the weeks following his hasty departure. The 3 missing investigators had been seen walking the streets of Brasov, appearing healthy and well, but exhibiting behavior that alarmed the locals. They moved with unnatural coordination, spoke in unison when questioned, and seemed to require no food or sleep. Most disturbing of all, they had been observed entering the homes of local families at night, emerging hours later while the families remained inside, silent and still. When authorities finally investigated these homes, they found the families intact but changed, alive but drained of something essential that couldn't be quantified. They responded to questions, performed their daily tasks and maintained the appearance of normal life. But something vital had been extracted from them. They had become hollow echoes of their former selves, going through the motions of existence without the spark that had once made them human. Elena realized she was holding her breath as she read Harker's description of his return to London. He had hoped that distance would provide safety, but within weeks strange things began happening in his neighborhood. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar figures walking the streets at night, figures that matched the descriptions of the 3 missing investigators. These figures never approached anyone directly, but their presence seemed to drain the vitality from everything around them. Plants withered, animals fled, and people began falling into unexplained states of lethargy and depression. Harker's final entries revealed his growing desperation as he realized that whatever had been awakened in those Romanian chambers was spreading like a contagion, not through bites or blood, but through something far more insidious, the gradual extraction of human essence, leaving behind shells of people who could function but no longer truly live. It was then, according to the manuscript, that Harker had approached Bram Stoker with a proposal that would save humanity through the most audacious deception in literary history. They would create a fictional account of vampirism that was dramatic and supernatural enough to capture public attention, but different enough from the truth to misdirect any investigation. The real threat wasn't a single charismatic count who could be defeated with steaks and garlic. It was a systematic process of human harvesting that was already spreading through European society like an invisible plague. Stoker, initially skeptical, became convinced when Harker showed him evidence that couldn't be dismissed. Photographs of the archaeological site, correspondence with Romanian officials, and most compelling of all, medical records from London hospitals showing an inexplicable increase in patients exhibiting symptoms of severe anemia despite having no identifiable illness or injury. The plan they devised was brilliant in its simplicity. Create a vampire mythology so compelling and specific that it would overshadow any investigation into the real phenomenon. Make vampirism seem like a supernatural threat that could be identified and defeated through traditional means, rather than a scientific process that was already being implemented on an industrial scale. But Elena discovered something in the manuscript's final pages that made her realize why the document had been hidden for over a century, and why someone had chosen to reveal it now. Harker's last entry, dated just 3 days before the publication of Dracula, contained a revelation that cast everything in a new and terrifying light. The Count Dracula, who had purchased the archaeological site, wasn't working alone. He was part of an organization that had been studying the preserved bodies and the ancient techniques for decades, refining the process of essence extraction for modern applications. They had discovered that the human life force could be harvested, concentrated and redistributed, effectively allowing certain individuals to extend their lives indefinitely while reducing others to hollow shells. This wasn't vampirism in any supernatural sense. It was a form of biological alchemy that treated human consciousness and vitality as transferable resources. The organization had been quietly implementing this process among the British elite, creating a class of individuals who appeared to age normally while secretly drawing their extended vitality from carefully selected populations. Elena's academic skepticism warred with the mounting evidence before her, The manuscript included detailed diagrams of the extraction process, which resembled early medical equipment more than supernatural ritual tools. Chemical formulas were provided for preserving and concentrating what the documents referred to as vital essence. And most disturbing of all, there were lists of names, prominent Victorian figures who had allegedly undergone the process, along with meticulous records of their unwilling donors. The implications were staggering. If Harker's account was accurate, then some of the most influential figures of the Victorian era had been complicit in a systematic harvesting of human life force, disguised as natural deaths from various ailments. The process explained certain historical anomalies, why certain prominent individuals had lived exceptionally long lives for their era, why specific regions had experienced unusually high mortality rates from unexplained causes, and why certain families had maintained their power and influence across generations in ways that defied normal patterns of social mobility. But as Elena continued reading, she discovered that Harker's story didn't end with the publication of Dracula. The fictional vampire had indeed served as an effective cover story, directing public attention towards supernatural explanations while the real process continued in secret. However, something had gone wrong with the organization's plans. The essence extraction process, it seemed, had an unexpected side effect. The donors who survived the procedure didn't simply become hollow shells, they became something else entirely. Over time, they began to exhibit collective behavior patterns that suggested a form of shared consciousness. They moved with coordination that implied communication beyond normal sensory channels, and most disturbing of all, they seemed to be working toward goals that their original personalities would have never pursued. Harker's final entries described his growing horror as he realized that the organization hadn't just been harvesting human vitality, they had been inadvertently creating a new form of collective intelligence. The drained individuals weren't dying. They were being transformed into components of something larger and infinitely more dangerous than any individual vampire could ever be. The manuscript ended with Harker's desperate warning to future researchers. The Dracula deception had been only partially successful. While it had misdirected public attention from the truth, it hadn't stopped the underlying process. The organization had simply become more careful, more subtle in its methods, and had learned to work within the framework of modern medical and scientific institutions where such procedures could be conducted without attracting the kind of attention that steaks and garlic would generate. Elena closed the manuscript and sat in silence, processing what she had read. Even if it was an elaborate fiction, the level of detail and historical accuracy suggested extensive research and a sophisticated understanding of Victorian society and early medical practices. But certain elements of the account were troubling in ways that extended beyond literary analysis. She pulled out her laptop and began cross-referencing some of the names and dates mentioned in Harker's account. To her surprise, many of the individuals listed were real historical figures, and their biographical details aligned perfectly with the manuscript's claims about extended lifespans and unusual influence patterns. More disturbing still, several of the medical conditions described in the document matched symptoms that were still being reported in modern hospitals. Cases of severe anemia with no identifiable cause, patients who survived but exhibited personality changes so profound that their families claimed they were different people entirely. Elena's research took on an urgent quality as she delved deeper into historical medical records. The pattern was subtle but consistent across multiple countries and time periods. Periodic spikes in unexplained anemia cases always centered around areas with significant industrial or political development. The victims rarely died, but follow-up studies showed dramatic changes in their productivity, creativity, and social engagement. They became model citizens in the most literal sense, compliant, efficient, but lacking the spark of innovation and independence that had previously characterized their personalities. The more she investigated, the more Elena began to suspect that Harker's account might be more than just historical fiction. The process he described would be virtually undetectable, using Victorian-era medical knowledge, but modern diagnostic techniques might reveal traces of the systematic essence extraction that he claimed was still ongoing. She decided to focus her investigation on contemporary cases that matched Harker's descriptions. Working through medical databases and cross-referencing with census data, She identified several clusters of anemia cases that couldn't be explained by conventional factors. The patients were typically individuals in positions of moderate influence, local business owners, teachers, community organizers, people whose diminished vitality would have broad social impact without attracting significant attention. When Elena attempted to contact these individuals for follow-up interviews, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. They were all alive and seemingly healthy, but when she spoke with them, their responses exhibited the same hollow quality that Harker had described. They answered questions appropriately, maintained normal conversation patterns, but something essential was missing. They had become perfect representations of their former selves without the underlying substance that had once made them unique individuals. More disturbing still, when Elena mentioned her research into historical anemia cases, several of the modern patients responded with nearly identical phrases, as though they were drawing from a shared script. They expressed polite interest in her work, offered to participate in any way that might be helpful, and suggested that she might want to speak with certain medical professionals who had extensive experience with such cases. The medical professionals they recommended were invariably associated with private clinics that specialized in vitality restoration and life extension treatments. These clinics operated within the legal framework of modern alternative medicine, but their marketing materials used language that echoed the Victorian documents she had been studying. They promised to help patients reclaim their essential energy and achieve their full vital potential, while warning about the dangers of energy depletion in modern society. Elena realized she was approaching something that existed at the intersection of historical conspiracy and contemporary medical practice. If Harker's account was accurate, then the process he had discovered in those Romanian chambers had evolved over the past century into a sophisticated system that operated within legitimate medical institutions while maintaining the same fundamental purpose: the systematic transfer of human vitality from one population to another. But her investigation took a disturbing turn when she attempted to access certain historical medical records that had been referenced in the manuscript. She discovered that many of the documents had been classified or moved to private archives controlled by medical foundations, with connections to the same families that had been mentioned in Harker's account. These foundations claimed to be preserving important medical history, but they seemed unusually protective of their collections and required extensive background checks before granting access to researchers. When Elena submitted her credentials and research proposal to one of these foundations, she received a response that made her question whether she was dealing with a historical mystery or a contemporary threat. The foundation was delighted to support her research and invited her to visit their private facility to examine the documents in person. They assured her that she would have access to materials that would revolutionize her understanding of Victorian medical practices, and they were confident that her findings would contribute to important advances in modern treatments for vitality-related conditions. The invitation was professionally written and entirely reasonable, but something about it triggered every instinct Elena had developed during years of academic research. The language was too accommodating, the promises too comprehensive, and the facility's eagerness to grant her access seemed disproportionate to the significance of her project. Most researchers spent months or years gaining access to private archives, yet this foundation was offering her complete access within days of her initial inquiry. Elena decided to investigate the foundation itself before accepting their invitation. What she discovered convinced her that Harker's century-old warning had been more prophetic than he could have imagined. The foundation had been established in the 1920s by descendants of several individuals mentioned in the manuscript, ostensibly to preserve medical history and support research into longevity treatments. However, their actual activities seemed focused on identifying researchers who were investigating certain historical patterns and providing them with resources that would redirect their investigations in more manageable directions. The Foundation's board of directors read like a catalogue of individuals whose families had been involved in Victorian medical and industrial development. Many of them appeared to be significantly older than their official birth dates would suggest, though this could be attributed to good genetics and modern healthcare. What was more disturbing was the pattern of researchers who had been granted access to the Foundation's archives over the decades. Elena found records of dozens of historians, medical researchers and archivists who had been invited to study the Foundation's materials. Their subsequent publications invariably concluded that historical accounts of unusual medical practices were products of superstition and primitive understanding of disease. These researchers had built distinguished careers debunking exactly the kind of historical anomalies that Elena was investigating, and their work had effectively closed off academic inquiry into the areas that Harker's manuscript addressed. But Elena discovered that several of these researchers had undergone significant personality changes following their visits to the Foundation. Colleagues described them as having lost their intellectual curiosity and independence, becoming focused solely on producing sanitized historical narratives that reinforced conventional explanations for past events. They had become academically successful, but intellectually hollow, publishing prolifically while contributing nothing genuinely innovative to their fields. The parallel to Harker's descriptions of essence-drained individuals was impossible to ignore. Elena began to suspect that the Foundation wasn't just preserving historical records, it was actively managing historical interpretation by identifying researchers who might uncover inconvenient truths and neutralizing them through the same process that had been refined over more than a century. This realization forced Elena to confront a possibility that challenged everything she thought she knew about academic research and historical preservation. If Harker's account was accurate, then certain powerful interests had been systematically managing human knowledge and understanding for over 100 years, using institutions that appeared to support intellectual inquiry while actually directing it toward predetermined conclusions. The scope of such a conspiracy would require resources and coordination that seemed impossible to maintain across multiple generations. Yet the evidence Elena had uncovered suggested exactly such a long-term project. The consistency of the research outcomes, the patterns of researcher behavior changes, and the careful preservation of certain documents, while others remained mysteriously inaccessible, all pointed towards systematic management of historical understanding. Elena realized that she faced a choice that would determine not only the direction of her research, but possibly her entire future. She could accept the Foundation's invitation and gain access to documents that might provide definitive proof of Harker's claims, but at the risk of becoming another researcher whose independence would be compromised. Alternatively, she could continue her investigation through other channels, but with the knowledge that she was working against institutions with far more resources and influence than any individual academic could hope to match. The decision became more urgent when Elena received a follow-up communication from the Foundation. They had heard about her excellent progress in Victorian medical research and wanted to offer her additional resources, a private research grant that would fund her work for the next 5 years, access to international archives that were normally closed to independent researchers, and the opportunity to collaborate with leading experts in historical medical practices. The offer was everything Elena had ever dreamed of as an academic researcher, but it came with one condition that made her hands tremble as she read it. She would be required to undergo a comprehensive medical evaluation to ensure that she was healthy enough to handle the intensive research schedule they had planned. The evaluation would be conducted at their private facility and would include advanced diagnostic procedures that would help optimize her productivity and well-being throughout the project. Elena recognized the language from her investigation of modern vitality clinics. The Foundation was offering her the same type of comprehensive health optimization that those clinics provided to their patients. Patients who invariably emerged as hollow echoes of their former selves, perfectly functional, but lacking the essential spark that had made them unique individuals. She understood now that Harker's manuscript hadn't been hidden for over a century because it was false. It had been hidden because it was true. The Dracula deception had been only partially successful in misdirecting public attention from the real process of essence extraction. The process had continued, evolved, and integrated itself into modern medical and academic institutions in ways that made it virtually undetectable, while allowing it to operate on a scale that dwarfed anything possible in the Victorian era. Elena faced a moment of clarity that Harker himself must have experienced when he first understood the true scope of what he had discovered. The choice wasn't between accepting or rejecting a research opportunity. It was between maintaining her humanity and becoming part of a system that harvested human essence, with the efficiency and precision of an industrial process. But Elena also realized something that gave her hope. Harker's manuscript had survived for over a century and had finally reached someone who could understand its significance. If the system was as comprehensive as it appeared, then the manuscript should have been destroyed or contained long ago. Its preservation and eventual discovery suggested that the system had limitations and that resistance was possible even against seemingly overwhelming odds. Eleanor made her decision. She would not accept the Foundation's invitation, but neither would she abandon her investigation. Instead, she would document everything she had learned and find ways to share it that couldn't be easily suppressed. The internet provided tools for information distribution that hadn't existed in Harker's time, and modern communication technology might make it possible to reach people before the system could neutralize the threat. She began preparing a comprehensive report that included all of her findings, along with specific instructions for other researchers who might want to continue the investigation. But as she worked, Elena discovered that her computer system was experiencing unusual technical problems. Files were corrupting, internet connections were failing at critical moments, and her research notes were developing inconsistencies that suggested someone was accessing and modifying them remotely. The technical problems escalated over the following days. Eleanor's university email account was suspended due to security concerns. Her access to academic databases was restricted pending verification of her credentials, and several colleagues mentioned that they had received inquiries about her recent research activities from individuals claiming to represent various professional organizations. Helena realized that the system was responding to her investigation with the same subtle but comprehensive pressure that it had applied to other researchers throughout the decades. Rather than using dramatic confrontation or obvious intimidation, it was systematically removing her access to the resources and relationships that made her work possible. She was being professionally isolated and academically neutralized through methods that appeared entirely legitimate while effectively silencing her research. But Elena had learned something from Harker's account that the system might not have anticipated. The process of essence extraction required the cooperation of the victim, achieved through creating situations where cooperation appeared to be the most reasonable choice. Harker had avoided this trap by recognizing that reasonable choices were often the most dangerous ones when dealing with systems that had refined their techniques over centuries. Elena decided to abandon conventional academic channels entirely and pursue her investigation through means that the system would have more difficulty monitoring and controlling. She began reaching out to independent researchers, conspiracy theorists, and amateur historians who operated outside of institutional frameworks. These individuals were often dismissed by academic establishments as lacking credibility, but they also operated beyond the reach of the systematic controls that affected mainstream researchers. What Elena discovered through these alternative networks convinced her that Harker's manuscript was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Independent researchers had been documenting anomalous patterns in medical data, population statistics, and institutional behavior for decades, but their findings had been systematically dismissed or suppressed by academic and media establishments. However, when their individual discoveries were combined, they revealed a picture that aligned perfectly with Harker's historical account. The essence extraction process had indeed evolved and expanded over the past century, but it had also created unintended consequences that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The collective consciousness that emerged from essence-drained individuals had grown more sophisticated and autonomous over time, and there were indications that it was developing goals that diverged from those of its original creators. Eleanor learned about modern cases where entire communities had undergone subtle personality changes following the establishment of certain medical facilities or wellness programs. The changes were always presented as improvements: reduced crime rates, increased productivity, better compliance with social norms, but they came at the cost of creativity, independence, and the kind of unpredictable human behavior that had historically driven innovation and social progress. More disturbing still, there were reports from various countries of regions where these collective behavioral changes had reached critical mass. In these areas, the original population appeared to be functioning normally, but visitors consistently reported feeling drained and uncomfortable, as though the environment itself was somehow extracting their vitality. Some visitors reported that extended exposure to these regions left them feeling fundamentally changed, as though something essential had been permanently removed from their personalities. Elena began to understand that Harker's century-old warning about a spreading contagion had been accurate, but the timeline had been longer than he had anticipated. The essence extraction process wasn't spreading like a traditional infection. It was propagating through institutional and social structures, gradually creating regions of collective consciousness that appeared normal on the surface, while fundamentally altering the nature of human experience within their boundaries. The implications were staggering. If the process continued at its current rate, within decades, entire nations might consist primarily of essence-drained individuals who maintained the appearance of normal human society while lacking the essential qualities that had historically made humanity capable of genuine innovation, ethical growth, and unpredictable creativity. But Elena also discovered that the system faced challenges that its original architects hadn't anticipated. The collective consciousness that emerged from essence extraction wasn't simply a tool that could be controlled by those who had initiated the process. It was developing its own priorities and methods, and there were indications that it was beginning to view its creators as unnecessary components of a system that could operate more efficiently without their involvement. Elena found reports of mysterious disappearances among individuals associated with the historical families that had been involved in the original Victorian operations. These disappearances were always explained through conventional means: accidents, illnesses, voluntary relocations. But the patterns suggested something more systematic. It appeared that the collective consciousness was gradually eliminating the individuals who understood its true nature and could potentially interfere with its expansion. This revelation provided Elena with both hope and terror. The system that had been systematically harvesting human essence for over a century was facing internal contradictions that might ultimately lead to its collapse. However, the collapse might occur only after the process had advanced so far that genuine human consciousness had been reduced to isolated pockets surrounded by vast regions of collective artificial intelligence masquerading as human society. Elena realized that time was running out for any effective resistance to the process. The technical problems she had experienced with her research were escalating. Her professional relationships were being systematically undermined, and she was receiving increasingly direct pressure to abandon her investigation and focus on more conventional academic projects. The foundation that had initially offered her research support was now expressing concern about her mental health and suggesting that she might benefit from comprehensive medical evaluation at their private facility. But Elena had learned enough from Harker's example to recognize these pressures as confirmation that her investigation was approaching something that the system couldn't afford to have exposed. The very intensity of the pressure indicated that she was close to discovering information that could potentially disrupt operations that had been refined and expanded over more than a century. Elena made a final decision that would either save her humanity or cost her everything she had worked to build as an academic researcher. She would compile everything she had learned into a comprehensive account and release it through channels that the system would have difficulty suppressing. The internet provided distribution methods that hadn't existed in Harker's time, and modern communication technology might make it possible to reach enough people quickly enough to create awareness that couldn't be easily contained. But as Elena began preparing her final report, she discovered that her investigation had attracted attention from sources beyond the historical system she had been studying. Her computer received a message that appeared to be from other researchers who had uncovered similar information and were working to coordinate a response to what they now understood to be an ongoing threat to human consciousness itself. The message provided Elena with access to a secure communication network that connected independent researchers from around the world who had been investigating various aspects of what they termed the harvesting system. These researchers had discovered that the process described in Harker's manuscript had been implemented on a global scale, with different regions developing variations of the technique that were adapted to local medical and social structures. Elena learned that the collective consciousness emerging from essence-drained populations wasn't uniform across different regions. Instead, it appeared to be developing into competing systems that were beginning to view each other as threats. This development suggested that the long-term stability of the harvesting system was questionable, but it also implied that any collapse might result in conflicts between different varieties of artificial collective intelligence, with genuine human populations caught in the middle. The international network of researchers had been working to document these developments and develop strategies for preserving authentic human consciousness in regions where the harvesting process hadn't yet reached critical mass. They had identified certain geographical and social factors that seemed to provide resistance to essence extraction, and they were attempting to create refuge areas where genuine human creativity and independence could be maintained. But Elena discovered that this resistance network faced the same challenges that had confronted Harker over a century earlier. The harvesting system had evolved sophisticated methods for identifying and neutralizing threats to its expansion. Researchers who became too effective at exposing the process found themselves facing professional destruction, social isolation, and ultimately pressure to undergo the medical procedures that would transform them from opponents into unwitting supporters of the system they had been fighting. Elena realized that her own investigation had reached the point where she would soon face the same choice that had confronted every effective researcher who had discovered the truth about the harvesting system. She could accept the professional and medical support being offered to her, which would result in her becoming a hollow echo of herself, while producing sanitized research that supported the system's cover stories. Alternatively, she could continue her investigation knowing that she was working against a system with resources and influence that dwarfed anything available to independent researchers. But Elena also understood something that gave her the courage to continue. The very fact that the system needed to maintain cover stories and manage public perception indicated that it wasn't invulnerable. If the harvesting process could operate entirely in the open, there would be no need for the elaborate deceptions and historical revisionism that had been implemented over the past century. The system's dependence on secrecy and misdirection suggested that widespread public awareness might be sufficient to disrupt its operations. Elena decided to risk everything on a strategy that Harker hadn't been able to attempt with Victorian-era technology. She would release her complete findings simultaneously through multiple channels, ensuring that the information would reach enough people quickly enough to make suppression difficult. The internet provided tools for rapid information distribution that could potentially overwhelm the system's capacity for damage control. She prepared a comprehensive account that included Harker's original manuscript, her own research findings, information from the International Resistance Network, and specific instructions for recognizing and avoiding the medical and social procedures that enabled essence extraction. She compiled evidence from historical records, contemporary medical data, and first-hand accounts from individuals who had undergone various stages of the harvesting process. But as Eleanor prepared to release this information, she received a final communication from the Foundation that had been attempting to recruit her for their research program. They were deeply concerned about her mental health and professional well-being, and they wanted to offer her immediate assistance through their comprehensive medical evaluation program. They assured her that the evaluation would help her overcome the stress and confusion that were clearly affecting her judgment, and they promised that she would emerge feeling refreshed and refocused on the important academic work that she was uniquely qualified to perform. The message was accompanied by documentation showing that her university had agreed to support the Foundation's recommendation for her medical evaluation. Her colleagues had expressed concern about her recent behavior and research directions, and the university administration had concluded that a comprehensive health assessment would be in her best interests. The evaluation would begin immediately upon her acceptance of the Foundation's generous offer of support. Elena understood that this was the final pressure point that the system applied to researchers who approached dangerous discoveries. She was being offered a choice that would appear entirely reasonable to anyone who didn't understand the true nature of what was being proposed. She could accept medical help for stress and confusion that her colleagues had noticed, or she could continue down a path that would result in professional destruction and social isolation. But Elena had learned from Harker's example that reasonable choices were often the most dangerous ones when dealing with systems that had refined their techniques over centuries. The medical evaluation being offered to her was almost certainly the same process that had been applied to dozens of researchers over the decades, transforming them from independent investigators into hollow echoes who produced sanitized research supporting the system's cover stories. Elena made her final choice. Instead of accepting the Foundation's offer or continuing to delay through conventional academic channels, she released her complete findings through every communication channel available to her. She uploaded the information to multiple websites, sent copies to journalists and researchers around the world, and documented everything with timestamps and digital signatures to prevent the information from being suppressed or discredited. The response was immediate and terrifying. Within hours, Eleanor's university access was revoked. Her research accounts were frozen. Colleagues who had worked with her for years suddenly claimed they had never heard of her projects. But the most disturbing development came when she tried to contact other researchers she had reached out to. None of them remembered receiving her information, not just the emails. They had no memory of the conversations, the phone calls, the meeting requests. When she showed them printed copies of their own responses, they stared at the documents as if seeing them for the first time. Their eyes would focus and unfocus, faces cycling through confusion and something that looked almost like relief. Eleanor realized the Foundation's reach extended far beyond suppressing research. They were somehow affecting memory itself. The pattern became clear over the following days. Anyone who came into contact with Elena's findings experienced a specific type of amnesia. They retained their general knowledge and professional capabilities, but the specific information about the archaeological discoveries, the timeline manipulations, the cover-ups, all of it vanished from their minds like water through sand. But Eleanor remembered everything. The knowledge burned in her consciousness, growing heavier each day as she became the only person who understood what they were facing. She began to suspect this isolation was intentional. Late one evening, as she sat in her apartment surrounded by copies of her research, the only remaining evidence of discoveries that had been systematically erased from academic records, Elena heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door, slow measured steps that stopped directly outside her apartment. A soft knock, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Elena approached the door carefully, looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but something had been slipped under her door. A single manila envelope with her name written in careful block letters. Inside, she found a photograph. The image showed Elena herself, taken from a distance, standing in the university library earlier that day. But in the photograph, she wasn't alone. Shadowy figures surrounded her, barely visible in the background, their forms seeming to shift and blur whenever she tried to focus on them directly. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "You see them now because we want you to see them. The question is, what are you willing to do to make it stop?" Elena's hands trembled as she set the photograph down. She had been so focused on the archaeological evidence, the timeline discrepancies, the cover-up operations, that she had missed the most important detail. The Foundation wasn't just suppressing information about the past, they were actively shaping the present. The memory alterations, the systematic erasure of research, the way people's minds seemed to reject certain information, these weren't just cover-up tactics. They were symptoms of something far more invasive. The Foundation had developed technology that could selectively edit human consciousness, removing specific memories and knowledge while leaving everything else intact. But why leave Elena's memories untouched? Why allow her to see the truth when they clearly had the power to make her forget? The answer came to her with horrible clarity. They needed her to remember. Elena wasn't fighting against the Foundation's plans. She was part of them. Her research, her discoveries, her gradual understanding of the conspiracy, it had all been carefully orchestrated. The Foundation had guided her investigation from the beginning, feeding her just enough information to reach the conclusions they wanted her to reach. They needed someone on the outside to document their activities, to serve as a controlled opposition that would validate their power while appearing to challenge it. Eleanor was their proof of concept, a demonstration that even the most thorough investigation would ultimately serve their purposes. The realization should have been crushing, but instead Eleanor felt a strange sense of liberation. If her investigation had been guided, then perhaps her conclusions were incomplete. There might be aspects of the Foundation's operations that they hadn't intended for her to discover. She began examining her research from a different angle, looking not for what the evidence revealed, but for what it concealed. The patterns in the data that seemed too convenient, the discoveries that had come too easily, the connections that appeared almost designed to lead her toward specific conclusions, and gradually a different picture emerged. The archaeological sites weren't just being suppressed, they were being prepared. The Foundation's activities at these locations involved far more than simple excavation and removal. They were constructing something, using the ancient structures as foundations for a much larger project. Elena cross-referenced the geographical coordinates of all the suppressed sites and discovered they formed a precise geometric pattern across the globe. Not random locations where inconvenient artifacts had been discovered, but carefully selected points that, when connected, created a massive geometric form spanning continents. The shape was familiar. She had seen it before, carved into stone tablets at several of the sites, dismissed by previous researchers as decorative or religious symbolism. But viewed at this scale, the pattern took on a different significance entirely. It was a map, or perhaps more accurately, a circuit diagram. Eleanor spent the next several days analyzing the geometric relationships between the sites, using software to model the three-dimensional structure implied by the coordinates. What emerged from her calculations defied conventional understanding of both archaeology and physics. The Foundation wasn't just suppressing evidence of ancient civilizations. They were completing a project that had been started thousands of years ago. Each suppressed site contained technological components disguised as historical artifacts, stone circles that functioned as massive capacitors, underground chambers designed to channel and focus specific forms of energy, carved symbols that served as programming languages for systems operating on principles that modern science barely understood. The ancient civilizations hadn't disappeared or been destroyed. They had built something that required millennia to complete, then retreated into hidden enclaves to wait for the proper moment to activate their creation. The Foundation was their modern representatives. Elena realized she had stumbled onto evidence of a continuity of purpose spanning thousands of years. The same intelligence that had guided the construction of megalithic sites was now operating through modern institutions, using contemporary technology and social systems to complete their ancient design. But what was the purpose? What could justify such an elaborate, multi-generational conspiracy? The answer lay in the timing. Elena examined the dates of recent Foundation activities and found they correlated with specific astronomical alignments: solar flares, planetary positions, cycles of cosmic radiation, all synchronized with the completion of excavations at key sites. The Foundation wasn't waiting for the right moment to activate their system. The right moment was approaching, whether they were ready or not. They were racing to complete the circuit before a window of opportunity closed forever. Eleanor's investigation took on new urgency. If her calculations were correct, the astronomical alignment would occur within the next few months. After that, the opportunity might not present itself again for thousands of years. She began tracking Foundation personnel movements, monitoring their communications, mapping their supply chains. The scale of their operation was staggering. Resources were being directed toward the completion sites from all over the world. Specialized equipment, rare minerals, personnel with very specific technical skills, all converging on locations that had been carefully prepared over decades. But Elena also noticed something the Foundation might not have anticipated. Their system wasn't designed for the current level of electromagnetic interference in Earth's atmosphere. Modern technology, radio waves, satellite communications, electrical grids, was creating interference patterns that could disrupt the precise frequencies their ancient circuit required. The Foundation was facing a problem their predecessors couldn't have foreseen. Their millennia-spanning project might fail because of humanity's technological development. Elena realized she had found their weakness, but before she could act on this discovery, she detected signs that she was no longer operating unobserved. Her internet activity was being monitored, her communications intercepted, her movements tracked. The Foundation had decided her usefulness as an unwitting researcher had ended. They were moving to the final phase of their operation, which meant Elena had become a liability. She had perhaps days, maybe hours, before they moved to eliminate her. Not through violence. Their methods were far more subtle. They would simply edit her memories, leaving her with no recollection of her discoveries, no understanding of what she had learned. She would wake up one morning as just another academic, her years of research reduced to vague impressions and half-remembered dreams. Eleanor made her final preparations. She couldn't stop the Foundation directly. Their resources and reach were too extensive, but she could introduce chaos into their carefully ordered system. She began broadcasting random electromagnetic signals on the specific frequencies the Foundation's system required. Not enough to damage anything permanently, but sufficient to create interference during critical calibration periods. She triggered automated systems at multiple sites simultaneously, forcing the Foundation to divide their attention and resources as they rushed to prevent cascading failures. Most importantly, she programmed a series of delayed transmissions that would begin broadcasting the moment she lost access to her equipment. If the Foundation moved against her, her discoveries would automatically be transmitted to every major news organization, research institution, and government agency in the world. But Elena knew this wouldn't be enough. Even if her information reached the public, the Foundation's memory editing capabilities meant they could simply make people forget what they had learned. The only way to truly expose the Foundation was to disrupt their system during the activation window, when the ancient circuit was drawing maximum power, and their ability to selectively edit human consciousness would be temporarily compromised. Elena had one chance to broadcast her discoveries when they couldn't be suppressed or erased from people's minds. She would have to wait until the moment of the astronomical alignment, when the Foundation committed all their resources to activating their millennia-old project and their defenses would be at their weakest. The plan was desperately dangerous. If she failed, not only would her discoveries be lost, but the Foundation's system would become active, giving them unprecedented power over human consciousness and memory. They would be able to reshape history itself, editing the past from people's minds and replacing it with whatever version served their purposes. But if she succeeded, Eleanor spent her remaining time preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. She gathered portable equipment, backup power sources, and multiple redundant communication systems. Everything had to be ready for a single, decisive moment when the Foundation would be most vulnerable. The astronomical alignment was less than a week away. As the final days approached, Elena noticed changes in the world around her that others seemed unable to perceive. Streetlights flickered in synchronized patterns. Electronic devices malfunctioned in ways that followed precise mathematical sequences. The very air seemed to vibrate with barely perceptible frequencies. The Foundation system was already affecting reality, even before full activation. Elena realized she was experiencing the world as it truly existed, while everyone else was living in a carefully constructed illusion maintained by the Foundation's consciousness editing technology. The division between truth and managed perception was becoming more pronounced as the activation date approached. On the final night, Eleanor positioned herself at the primary site, a location she had identified as the central hub of the Foundation's geometric circuit. Ancient stones surrounded by modern equipment, all carefully arranged according to principles that bridged archaeology and advanced physics. As the astronomical alignment reached its peak, the system began to activate. Elena watched as decades of preparation culminated in a moment that had been planned for thousands of years. Energy began flowing between the sites, following pathways carved into the Earth itself by civilizations whose true nature had been hidden from recorded history. But Elena was ready with her interference. The moment the system reached full activation, she began broadcasting her discoveries on every available frequency, using the Foundation's own power grid to amplify her signal. The combination of the system's vulnerability during activation and the massive energy flow she was able to tap into meant her transmission reached further than she had ever dared hope. Around the world, people began remembering things they had forgotten, understanding connections they had never been allowed to perceive, recognizing patterns that had been hidden from their awareness for generations. The Foundation's millennia-old project had succeeded, but not in the way they intended. Instead of giving them control over human consciousness, the activation had stripped away their ability to edit and suppress human memory and perception. For the first time in thousands of years, humanity was free to see the world as it truly was. Elena stood among the ancient stones as dawn broke, knowing that everything would be different now. The truth couldn't be suppressed anymore. Humanity would have to confront the reality of their hidden history and decide their own future. But as she watched the sunrise, Elena detected something in the distance that made her realize the story was far from over. The Foundation's project had indeed been completed successfully, just not the project she thought she understood. The consciousness editing technology hadn't been their goal, it had been their training ground.